Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to lunch. I'm really grateful that you would be willing to share your precious lunchtime with me to give this keynote to the Decolonizing Education Conference for 2022. It's an honor to be able to talk with you. As you know, this portion of my presentation is recorded, and I will join you at the end of it, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity for me to answer questions and engage in a discussion about some of what I'm going to share with you today. As you know, my name is Raquel Montoya Lewis, and I serve as a justice on the Washington State Supreme Court. Usually prior to my taking the screen in this case, or the stage in other cases when we're able to be in person, the introductions that are shared are introductions that talk about my professional accomplishments. That's the introduction you've grown to expect in an academic or professional setting, and it's an important one, particularly for me as a woman of color, to establish that I belong where I belong, that I've worked hard to get to where I am. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we go through people's accomplishments before we introduce them. What I'm going to share with you today is some of my family history, and it also reflects the traditional way I've been taught to introduce myself. That traditional way of introducing myself means that what I would do in a traditional setting, if I were presenting to people from my own community or presenting in communities that would normally expect this kind of traditional introduction, it means I would go back and introduce you to my ancestors, tell you their names, their clan membership, what I knew about them and their family history, and go through each ancestor and family member until you arrived at my parents, and then I would introduce myself. This approach to a traditional introduction is a way of reminding the speaker, in this case me, that I come from a long line of people who survived and people who didn't, and that I am one of those people who are charged with continuing to tell those stories for future generations, because of course, one day, just like all of us, I will be an ancestor and I will be someone that people speak of in the past tense. Perhaps that form of traditional introduction sounds in some respects sad, because we're thinking about future generations that perhaps don't include us. But it's really an important way for us to recognize as a community that despite all kinds of governmental regulation, attempts at ending our traditions, customs, languages, communities, that we have continued to persist and to survive. And so I share some of that story with that goal in mind, introducing you in my traditional way, but also sharing with you the experience of growing up in a community that has been regulated by the federal government and state governments in all kinds of ways, including attempts at forced assimilation and the educational system being used as a part of that. So I'm going to share my screen and introduce you to my family. You're going to see me flipping around a little bit, so you'll get the experience of I'm going to flip that so you get the right thing. There we go. So you will get the experience of me flipping around with technology a little bit. But what you should be seeing on the screen now is the screen that says Descendant Daughter, a story of forced assimilation. For those of you who are interested in talking to me more about this, and I will join you at the end of this presentation to answer questions and hopefully have a discussion. But I do just want you to take note that my email address is there, and that I include that email address on purpose because I'm interested in hearing from people as they have reflections or questions or thoughts about their own futures if they're thinking about going to law school and what that might look like. So I encourage you to contact me. You can write it down for the future, and you can always, of course, Google me and find that information as well. I'm going to start by briefly introducing you to some of the policies the federal government has used to deal with what they have formally called historically the Indian problem. You see that language used from the earliest days of our country, really up through language you'll see in formal documents in the 1960s and 70s. We've moved away from that terminology, but it is still a way of recognizing, to use that phraseology, to recognizing the manner in which the US federal government and state governments looked at Indigenous communities that pre-existed in this country before the start of the United States. Each of these different policies had different impacts on different communities, and there are well over 500 federally recognized tribes, and there are also tribes that are not federally recognized. And all of those communities were impacted in different ways by these kinds of federal policies. So I'm not going to be able to give you a detailed history of each of these policies, but I am going to just briefly go through them so that you have some sense of the variety of ways that the federal government used to attempt to address the Indian problem. So in the 1800s, late 1880s, there had been, leading up to this, attempts to move Native communities from their homelands to other parts of the country. And to do that sort of informally, there had been attempts to work with the tribes that were there through treaty processes and other things. But Congress passed formally something called the Allotment Act, as well as a separate act of Congress called the Indian Removal Act. Both of them are what they sound like. The Allotment Act was a way of Congress attempting to divest tribal communities of land and instead break the land up into individual squares of land for each, and these pieces of land would be given to individual male heads of households. So effectively saying, we want you to consider ownership of your land in the same way that white settlers considered ownership of land. That is, this piece of land, this square of land, whether it's 5 acres or 10 acres or 2, is mine and my family's to do with what I choose. This policy was a policy that had disastrous results in all kinds of ways, and I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. But many communities didn't look to men as heads of households, so that was one significant disconnect. But also communities, the Native communities that were impacted by this, for many didn't view land as individually owned, but rather communally owned. And so that shift from individual ownership to from communal ownership caused all kinds of problems. And it didn't result in what the federal government had hoped, which was that individual families would become individual families that worked the land in ways that were reflective of the mainstream ways of working land, creating farms, that kind of contribution to the larger economy, and ultimately the ability to buy and sell that land so that that land would go from ownership of by Native families to leave that ownership and go into ownership of white families and white communities. The Indian Removal Act is, again, exactly what it sounds like. And that is that when things did not work to change the characteristics of Native communities, the federal government simply passed laws that said Native people need to be moved by the federal government from lands that we want to lands we don't want. That's where you see things like the Trail of Tears and then the wholesale movement of Native communities from one part of the country to what was then called the Indian Territories, which we now know or call Oklahoma. Of course, there were already tribal communities in Oklahoma. And so moving those communities into Oklahoma caused all sorts of challenges. And then as you saw the growth of the white community in the United States and the movement of the country from east to west, Oklahoma and all points to the west of Oklahoma became of interest to settlers from who were US citizens and who were looking to profit off the land that where Native communities sat. So both of these policies were policies where there was a goal of changing the Native communities and making them either sell land and have that land go out of the possession of Native communities and into the possession of settlers, or to result in them becoming more sort of quote unquote mainstream and adopting farm practices and traditions and customs and the religion of the white settlers who were moving into these areas of the United States. The Allotment Act also did other things to destroy Native communities and traditions. There was a ban on tribal dancing contained in that, as well as a ban on giveaways, which is a very common way of tribes sharing wealth, which is if there was families that had more than others, there were traditional ways of sharing that and giving away things, whether that was food and other things of sustenance, or things like blankets or other things. And those are traditions that, despite this, persist to this day. In my own community, which is the Pueblo of Isleta in New Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which preceded any agreements between the federal government and the tribes, but was instead a treaty between Mexico and the tribes, protected the Pueblos from any of the ability of the federal government to either move people off land that the federal government sought or that white settlers sought, or sell it. So many of the Pueblos, if not all of them, in New Mexico were not subject to the Allotment Act and the Indian Removal Act. And so the community that I come from has been inhabiting our traditional lands for thousands of years. And some of the place that I come from, the homes have been inhabited as long as my community has been there. Not all of them, but many of them. And the consequence of that has been that it has been much more difficult, was much more difficult for the federal government to disrupt our community because we had treaty rights, so that once New Mexico became a part of the United States, those treaty rights came with us. And that became important in terms of the ability of our communities to stay where they had been since what is referred to in many treaties as time immemorial. The next policy that was attempted, and these crossover, as you can see, was the policy of assimilation. And that's where you see the federal government, by order of the federal government, ordering the removal of Indian children to have them sent to boarding schools, some thousands of miles away from their homelands, to be educated in an American educational system. This is where you begin to see real impacts on my own family, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. This policy was started in the 1870s, but and was formally discontinued in the 1920s, but went well beyond that because boarding schools and the requirement that children go to those boarding schools might have been abandoned as a federal requirement in the 1920s, but it was not abandoned as state requirements, and there were other things tied to making sure that Native children were educated in that formalized boarding school manner. In the 1930s, the federal government passed the Indian Reorganization Act. This was another attempt to try to make tribal governments look more like US governments. And there were benefits to the tribal governments who followed the requirements of the Indian Reorganization Act to make their governments look more like the federal government with constitutional separation of powers. So you see many tribes, including my own, passing Indian Reorganization Act constitutions in this era. Those constitutions are still in existence. My tribe still has a constitution that was modeled on the model constitution given to many tribes in the 1930s and beyond. And I've worked for many tribes in the Northwest who also have Indian Reorganization Act-based constitutions. That doesn't mean the governments are the same across the board. They certainly are not. But many of them start now with these founding documents that impose a form of separation of powers that did not exist in many of the tribes that have since adopted constitutions like that. Tribes persisted and continue to persist and exist today, as you know. But what became clear to the federal government was that they had the power to terminate the federal recognition of tribes. And one of the things you see in federal Indian law, beginning very early from the United States Supreme Court, is the recognition of the power of Congress to terminate, which means to no longer recognize the existence of federally recognized tribes. Of course, a tribe could continue to exist, but what it means to terminate a tribe is to say we no longer are required to have a government-to-government relationship with you. As far as the federal government is concerned, you no longer exist, and therefore our responsibility to you, which is laid out in statutes, treaties, as well as the Indian Reorganization Act constitutions passed by many of these tribes. It effectively ended those relationships when termination occurred. And that also meant that the responsibility the federal government had to individual tribal people to ensure that they had access to healthcare through the Indian Health Service, that they had access to education, and that those kinds of responsibilities continued. But under the under the termination policy, when a tribe was terminated, that simply stopped. Those policies that impacted tribes and impacted many tribes in the state of Washington. Some of those tribes have been re-recognized in recent years. Other tribes have not. One example is the Duwamish, who are people that inhabited the King County area have been attempting to establish federal recognition repeatedly year after year and have been denied re-recognition. I worked for the Nooksack Indian tribe, which was terminated in the 1960s and then re-recognized in the 1970s. And so it's sort of a mix across the state of Washington when you look at whether or not tribes were able to become reestablished and reestablish that government-to-government relationship. The government-to-government relationship really became a policy of the federal government in the 1970s. It was started by President Nixon and has been since then the approach the federal government has taken to tribal communities to say that it's our responsibility as the federal government to recognize that you are sovereign nations and to treat your government as a valid and active government that has the right to govern your communities in the manner you choose. And our responsibility is to recognize and support that. And it's also our responsibility to ensure that states do the same. Some states are better at that than others, but that continues to be the place where we find federal policy today. I just want to give you a brief image here to show you the impact of allotment. So what you see here is what is called, for those of us who work in this field, a classic checkerboard allotted reservation. So where you used to have the entire area that you're looking at on the screen as tribal reservation, which would be in the Peach area. So prior to allotments, everything would have been Peach. It would have been part of the tribal reservation. Then in pieces of property were broken up into these squares that you see and given to individual male heads of household for ownership. And there is this, it creates this checkerboard effect where you see these red squares of allotted land, some of which might continue to remain in tribal hands today, some of which may have passed out of tribal hands and ended up being purchased by non-native people. Once the process of allotment of these areas of land failed, reservations were reestablished in many communities. So for example, I used to work for the Lummi Nation, which is in Whatcom County near Bellingham. That is an allotted reservation, as is Nooksack and many other Washington reservations. And so the reservation has a boundary, but within that boundary, because of this policy, there are many people who own land who are non-native, who live on property that they own in what's called fee simple, which means they have ownership of that property. And then there are tribe people who own property in fee simple, which means they maintain ownership of that property. And then beyond that, there are large parts of the property of the area of the reservation that are held in trust and part of the reservation and owned by the tribe. It creates all kinds of complexity and disastrous messes that I could spend an entire quarter talking about. Obviously, don't have that time today, but I'll give you an example of some of the legal problems that creates. If someone is standing, for example, on one of these Peach pieces of property, so they're on the reservation, they're on tribally owned land, and they fire a gun, and the gunshot goes off that Peach piece of reservation and hits someone in the white piece of property next to it, which is owned by a white person, and that person is injured or killed. The question becomes, well, where did the crime occur? Was it when the gun was fired, or was it where it hit and killed the person? The problem with answering that question is the answer determines which police department responds. It determines which police department, or whether the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, investigates the crime, and it determines who prosecutes the crime. So it determines whether the state prosecutes, whether the tribe might be able to prosecute, or whether the federal government prosecutes that. And because those questions are so complex, very often what you see is crimes in areas that have property that looks like this don't get prosecuted at all. That is but one of many hundreds of problems that are created by this historical practice of allotment. So I'm going to introduce you to my own community and my own family. This is Sachima. Sachima is from the Pueblo of Laguna. And as I said, I'm a member of the Pueblo of Isleta, but I'm a descendant of the Pueblo of Laguna. And I have family members from both communities. Sachima grew up at the Pueblo of Laguna. One of the things that's a quote unquote benefit of being a tribal person is that because of all of these policies, Native people were tracked, by which I mean that there were very careful census data taken of our communities and their people. And that was also preserved through photographs. And so if you look in the National Archives, if you happen to be a Native person, you can often find photographs of your family members and your ancestors. This was a photograph taken in Sachima, we think somewhere around the 1870s. And Sachima was the wife of the governor of the Pueblo of Laguna. In my communities, we call people who are referred to here as chairs or chairpersons of tribes as governors. This was her husband, who was the governor of the Pueblo of Laguna for a long period of time, Jose Paisano. Both Sachima and Jose grew up speaking the Carasun language, which is the traditional language of Laguna. But you'll notice that my great-great-grandfather, Jose Paisano, also has a Spanish first name and surname. And the reason for that is that the names that were traditional names, like Sachima, were unpronounceable by the people taking census data and by others who were interacting with tribal people in many of the communities in New Mexico. And so they were either given Spanish last names, this was interactions with the Mexican government who were Spanish speaking, or they adopted Spanish first and last names. And nowadays you'll see a mix of English first names, Spanish first names, as well as tribal first names. So this is Carlisle Boarding School. This image is a class of Native children who were brought to Carlisle Boarding School by governmental order. Carlisle Boarding School, before it became Carlisle, was a military school run as a military school. And it actually is still a military school. Now that it is no longer Carlisle Boarding School, it serves as the U.S. Army War College. But there was a period of time during which this boarding school was created or founded as Carlisle Boarding School by Colonel Richard Pratt to do exactly what it says in the quotes here: kill the Indian, save the man. Meaning, destroy those things that make these children Native: their language, their religion, their ways of life, their food ways, their clothing, everything that made them who they are, and save them by teaching them, requiring them to speak English, to dress in the clothing that you see here, and you'll see that a little more clearly in a couple of pictures to come. And to do so by order. So there were 26 other boarding schools built upon Colonel Richard Pratt's model. He considered it, as did the federal government, to be very successful. And then there were also many other boarding schools that were not run by the federal government, but where Native children were sent by, again, federal order, that were run by the Catholic Church or other Christian churches. So this is an image taken in about 1880. It says, you can't really probably see it on your screen, but it says it was taken in July 1880, which we think is probably accurate. So early on in Carlisle boarding school's existence, it says Pueblos entered Carlisle. One of the things that they were very good at Carlisle boarding school was taking before and after pictures. They would take photographs of children who just arrived, and they would also take photographs as they were graduating or leaving Carlisle. And in this picture, I don't know all of the children who are represented here, but the young woman who's standing in the middle of the three children standing in the back, who's got a black kind of uniform on with a white bow tie, is my great-grandmother, Mary Perry or Kiotse. She was put on a train, as far as we know, without the permission of her parents, who had many children, and sent to Carlisle boarding school, which was in Pennsylvania. So I want you to imagine not speaking English or speaking very limited English, and growing up in a place that was the high desert of New Mexico, in a small community, and being put on a train with a bunch of other kids from your community, but lots of other communities, where the other kids spoke different languages, had different traditions and customs, and none of them knew where they were going. And they were put on a train and sent across the country to Pennsylvania, where they arrived at a boarding school that looked nothing like what they were used to from home, and where they were immediately being spoken to in English and expected to learn the English language. Just want you to take a moment and look at these kids and imagine what that was like. This is one of the before pictures. So this is a better picture that you can see. It's obviously quite stylized, as were all of these before and after pictures. These are three children from Laguna. This is Mary Perry, my great-grandmother, who was born in about 1865 and lived until 1953. And she was at Carlisle from about 1880 to about 1886. The date on when she left is a little bit unclear, but it looks like either 1884 or 1886. The other two children in this picture are Ben Thomas and John Chavez. Both of them are Laguna tribal members. And I was doing this presentation once in Pierce County, and one of the descendants of one of the young men in these pictures was in the audience. I look at this picture and I see my great-grandmother. Many of you probably still have great-grandmothers who are a part of your life. My great-grandmother's life is not just a historical artifact. Although I was born after her death, her stories and the stories of my great-great-grandparents were very much an alive part of my life. So it's very hard to see this, but this is called this is a newsletter that came from Carlisle boarding school called the Indian Helper. And you can look up, if you Google Carlisle Archive Dickinson University, you'll get the result that will send you to the archives of Carlisle Boarding School, and you'll be able to pull up all kinds of information, but you'll be able to look at these newsletters. They are shocking in their language. You will see in these newsletters advertisements selling Native children as maids and servants. The ads read as ads for adoption, but indicate what their skill sets are and what they've learned while being at Carlisle Boarding School. This, as I said, you are not probably able to see this at all. But I'll just read you very quickly some of the language that says, just as long as the Indians are ignorant, they will have to do what the people of knowledge and power tell them to do. No matter whether the demands are just or unjust, the Indians cannot help themselves. They may try to help themselves by fighting, but Indian fighting never lasts long. A few Indians and a few soldiers get killed. The Indians have to give up sooner or later. The war ends, and the Indian is poorer or still ignorant. Who or what is going to help you? Education, education, education. The best friends of Indians want to educate them in the very quickest way. And it goes on to talk about the quickest way being going to a boarding school like this one. Colonel Pratt in the 1980s gave many speeches about the success of this approach and said, he said all kinds of things, but these are a couple of quotes that I think are really emblematic of the forced assimilation that he deeply believed in and that seriously impacted my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my father, and myself. He said, it is a great mistake to think that the Indian is born an inevitable savage. He is born a blank, like all the rest of us. Left in the surroundings of savagery, he grows to possess a savage language, superstition, and life. When we allow him the freedom of association and the developing influences of social contact, then the Indian will quickly demonstrate that he can be truly civilized. And he himself will solve the question of what to do with the Indian. What he means by that is that once he gives up language, culture, tradition, and life ways, and adapts white approaches to all of those things, speaking English, practicing a Christian faith, and otherwise living a life that looks like what Pratt would expect, becoming farmers, otherwise becoming productive, quote unquote, members of society, that the federal government will no longer have an Indian problem. Mary Perry graduated from Carlisle and returned to Laguna. And this is a picture of the same three children upon their graduation from Carlisle. Each of these three people survived their experience at Carlisle. But as you've probably heard in the news, most, if not all, boarding schools have grave sites where children were buried because they could not survive the infections they were exposed to, things like flu and other germs, or they just simply died of broken hearts because they couldn't manage being away from home. There are incredible stories of families who have family members who somehow walked back from their boarding schools across hundreds of miles with no direction and somehow arrived back on their reservations to their family members. My great-grandmother returned to Laguna with a deep belief in the importance of speaking English, becoming Catholic, abandoning traditional approaches to life. Over time, that shifted and changed, and she came back around to speaking the Karasan language, although she spoke English as well as other indigenous languages. But she held deep shame, and we see this in letters she wrote back to Colonel Pratt, at her inability to convert her community to those practices that she learned at Carlisle boarding school. She carried with her that shame and passed that on to my grandmother. She became married, had many children, and my grandmother, May Paisano, was one of those children. This is a picture of Mary Perry here. So second from left, with her husband, who's on the first man on the left, William Paisano. These are my other great-grandparents from the Pueblo of Isleta on the right side of your screen, Petra Jojola Montoya and Juan Antonio Montoya. This photograph was taken on the day of my grandparents' wedding. This is my grandfather, Bartolo Montoya, and he went to Haskell Indian School. He didn't have to go there by force because his parents sent him there, having gone through the same educational system that that Mary Perry went through. And Mary Perry sent her own children to Haskell Indian School. This is May Paisano, my grandmother, who went to Haskell Indian School, where she met my grandfather. They both became educated as teachers, and they both taught. Taught in Indian boarding schools. And what I want you to notice in these graduation pictures, which is what you see here and what you see here, is that both of my grandparents were dressed in sort of mainstream white clothing, suits. It's maybe hard for you to see, but she has a necklace made of pearls. She's got some sort of traditional collared dress on. The way I remember my grandmother is much more the woman on the horse below, which is another picture of my grandmother, of course, much younger than I remember her. But she moved to the Pueblo of Isleta when she married my grandfather, and my father was raised at the Pueblo of Isleta. What that means is that my father spoke English. He spoke the Carasan Laguna language. He spoke the Tiwa Isleta language, and he understood about 3 other indigenous languages. And as I will share with you in just a moment, what that meant for him was that he was very proud of those things until he went to school. And I'll come back around to that in just a moment. I just want to note here that the Indian Citizenship Act was passed in 1924. Prior to this, Native people were not citizens of the United States. So they were subject to these federal policies, including educational policies, but they were not citizens. This made Native people citizens of the United States, but it was unclear whether it applied to people who were Pueblo people who were signatories to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. States determined the right to vote. And it wasn't until 1948 where there was a lawsuit in Arizona. And slightly after that, a separate lawsuit in the state of New Mexico brought by one of my uncles who had returned from fighting in World War II to return from that war, went to cast a ballot in a statewide election and was denied the right to cast a ballot because he was not a citizen of the United States, despite having served his country. This is a picture of him, and there are all kinds of articles about him if you wish to Google his name, but one of my uncles established the right to vote. And I just want to note that this was the right, he gained the right to vote for people like me who were enrolled members of a Pueblo 20 years before my birth. This is the Albuquerque Indian School. It was a boarding school. The building itself no longer exists as I understand it, although it was a school for a very long time, including up through parts of my life. My father went to this when it was a boarding school. It was where he began being beaten for speaking his indigenous language, as well as the indigenous languages he also spoke and used to communicate with other students. He was sent there voluntarily by my grandparents. And the consequence of that experience and his experience in a Catholic high school that he was sent to after he left Albuquerque Indian School was that he had tremendous fear of his indigenous languages and traditions. This is my father upon his enrollment at the club, into the U.S. Air Force. I was born not long after that, and he wanted me to grow up speaking the Tiwa language. I did not grow up on my reservation, although we returned there very frequently. But he was really torn because this is a photograph of my grandparents, who are on the right-hand side of the picture. My mother was a white woman from Australia who was Jewish, and I could tell you that side of my family history and the attempts at genocide and the destruction of my family on that side as well. But I don't have to tell you that story today. And my father. And so my father really struggled with teaching me the traditions he grew up with, although, as you can see by this picture, this is me getting one of my 3 Pueblo Tiwa names. There are traditional naming ceremonies that occur throughout your lifetime, and this was me receiving my 2nd name and sort of bringing me into our traditional clan structure. If you think back to the very first picture you saw at Sachima, much of what I'm wearing is very similar. And if you were to see pictures of me on my wedding day, would have been very similar clothing. So despite the many attempts to end our languages and our traditional customs and our traditional food ways, those things have been unsuccessful. They have been successful in impacting the transmission of language. I don't speak the Tiwa language. I don't speak Karasin. I can understand much of the Tiwa language when it is spoken to me. But when I was a tribal court judge for my own tribe, I was very careful to have a translator so that I was sure I didn't miss anything, because very often, while I could understand most of what was spoken in the Tiwa language, I wanted to make sure it was translated to English so that I would be certain I understood. I was educated in Department of Defense schools as we moved around the country while my father was in the military. And then when we moved to Albuquerque upon his retirement, when I was still in high school, I went to American high schools. There does not really exist, a way to continue, or there didn't exist at that time, a way to continue to be educated in Native environments. There is now a high school in Albuquerque that is for Native students. It's a really extraordinary place, and you can Google that school. And kids come from all over the state of New Mexico to go to that school. So finally, I will just say that these issues around Indian education continue to be significant, have significant impact. The federal government continues to be required to ensure that Native kids get educated. And if they're on the reservations, there are tribal schools. Many of those tribal schools are run by the tribal communities, but run under curricula that is prescribed to them. And many of those tribal schools are underfunded. And at the bottom bullet, you'll see my reference to the Stephen C. versus the Bureau of Indian Education case. I encourage you to look that up. There's an excellent article in The Atlantic that talks about that lawsuit and what should be required of the Bureau of Indian Education in terms of appropriate provision of resources for Native students who are in tribal schools, and in particular, Native students who have special needs. Really, the last thing I'll say is that when you look at Native kids who are in higher education, in today's world, you see that the data shows that Native students experience a much higher degree of stress in higher education because they often feel like they're continuing to be put in a position of having to choose between assimilation and achieving academic success and maintaining ties to traditional culture. Many students who Native students who spend more time with their families often feel less like they belong on their campuses. And I can attest to really feeling that tension when I was both in college, graduate school, and law school. And so I hope that brings you to thinking about what it means to belong and how you know that you belong in an educational system, particularly one that was built around the idea of eradication. I think this poll is a simple and elegant way to show the ways in which Native people are told they don't belong. This poll was taken right after the Washington football team announced that they were going to change their name. And I apologize that the R word remains in this poll, but I think it's reflective of the failure to understand the importance of removing slurs in mascots and team names. But what I want you to notice here is it said nearly half of the public opposes the name change, but Gen Z and Black adults are more likely to approve it. What really I want you to pay attention to is that it's broken down by white adults, Hispanic adults, Black adults, and other. Native people's voices were not reflected in this poll in any way, shape, or form. It's a constant message that we don't belong. I received that message from the earliest days I remember as a kindergarten student to experiences I've had in my workplace as recently as last week. And so persisting and surviving in those environments takes a tremendous amount of resilience and commitment, as well as extraordinary support. And I've been very lucky to, in my job, have the support of Native communities. When I was sworn in to the Washington State Supreme Court as the first Native American to take a seat on that bench, I asked the Port Gamble Slalom Singers to come and to sing in the courtroom because as I said on the day of my swearing in, I knew that building was not built with someone like me in mind, and I wanted our voices to ring out through that building as a way of saying that now I do belong. And the photograph to the right is me signing my oath of office. Finally, this is a photograph at the bottom of our current Washington State Supreme Court, which is the most diverse Supreme Court in the United States. We are an extremely diverse court, a very motivated court to address some of the issues we've talked about when they come in front of us. And I'm very proud to be a member of this court. And the top two pictures are when Justice Yu and I, right before the pandemic lockdown, visited Spokane and had the opportunity to meet with all kinds of people from Spokane, including tribal leaders and this young woman who you see on the right, who was expressing to me in this photograph, her mother is right behind her, how much it meant to her as a young Native woman to see me on the court. So I want to thank you for your time today and your attention. And I look forward to your questions and any discussion that we have time for now. So thank you.